everybody. Keith here. Hoping everyone's having a good day, enjoying life, living life, loving life. Want to remind everybody, please hit that like, share, and subscribe button. There's a PayPal link for anybody who wants to share some love. And of course, the StreamYard link is there for anybody that wants to join the panel. We've got John with us tonight. How you doing tonight, John?
I'm doing good, Keith.
Good. Always good to hear you.
Yeah.
Nice to see you again, Beneficiary. But we're talking about indemnification of government contractors again tonight. I've got a bunch of material stacked up, so we're going to be doing some videos on that again to get it caught up. Like I said last night or the night before, I've got an appointment set up with the IRS to do a forensic securities audit based on the cases that I've been working on lately. My companion with the credit collectors and the failure to appear for jury duty dismissal and stuff. So hopefully that will be a mechanism to get the ball rolling as far as what I'm calling a equitable relief by reversion and merger of the estates. So, and that's, you know, through the indemnification process, making all parties whole. That's simple basics. So we're going to take a look at this document tonight, and this I think is from 2016, I think it said. 2012. Incorporating change 1st of June 9th, 2014. So it's been in effect 10 years. They might even have a newer one with the new real ID, and that might be what took over this. But I just wanted to point this one out first before we get into everything, because what it comes down to is that government issue identification. And that's government property as a matter of Department of Defense. And this is identification cards required by the Geneva Conventions in accordance with the authority of Department of Defense directives, reissued, lists certain requirements for Department of Defense ID cards stipulated by the Geneva Conventions. And when you realize that this is a military government, even the states giving out those state IDs and driver's license, those are military identifications. Everything is military and it goes to that identification. The Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Services, under agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, under agreement with the Department of Commerce. Like I said, that Bureau of Vital Statistics is regulated by the Department of Commerce. That's the Health and Human Services that is creating the estate through the enumeration at birth, is creating that legal fictional estate. Rather than that being posed to a family Bible or something, it's being created by the state. A military operation in a military hospital known as a foundling hospital.
Right, and it was never declared in the private.
Correct. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. I'll go ahead and drop this link for everybody that wants to take a peek and scope it out. But that's basically the same lines as the real ID. When you look at the law for the real ID, it specifically says for federal employees and contractors. And that's how this all starts out, is that contract, some kind of contract. And when those contracts are implied like they are today in the modern time, almost every document you sign is an implied contract somewhere. There's supposed to be some kind of indemnification. And like I said, this is a military system. And under 10 U.S.C. 3861 fixed price, there's indemnification. There's a fixed price. And we go down here and we go indemnification cost in reimbursement. And this is for everything that you've paid into the system that wasn't fully due to be paid because you weren't qualified in the capacity that that record represented. Technically, everything is voidable in that what you paid in is reimbursable. It's supposed to come back to you. Those taxes, child support, everything. Because there was a process that you could use to obtain money, property, labor, or services on credit, and nobody's been using that. It says this clause provides for indemnification under 10 U.S.C. 3861 if the contractor meets all the terms and conditions of this clause. Claims losses and damages covered. Claims by third persons for death, bodily injury, sickness, or disease, or the loss, damage, or lost use of property. Claims include those for reasonable expense of litigation for settlement. Litigation for settlement. The terms third persons include employees of the contractor. The loss, damage, and lost use of the contractor's property, but excluding lost profit. And loss, damage, or lost use of the government's property. That identification is government property. So if you go through the loss, damage, or lost use of the government property as so authorized, and then you have a claim. What is that claim? The claim is for the reasonable expenses for a litigation for settlement. It says litigation or settlement, excuse me. Reasonable expenses for settlement. If they've got you convinced of using government property, official documents, applications, all that stuff, claiming to be a taxpayer of some sort, that's a military operation. Martial law chiefly affects the police and the collection of public revenue and taxes. You've been claimed to be a public body ever since you were born. So, and I'll drop that link down there. You can check that out. And now we're going to get onto this indemnification of government contractors.
So, Keith, the BC, I mean, it could be one of many things. Like one of them could be like a trust registration, but it could also be a settlement certificate at the heart, right?
Correct. Yeah, you define its terms by its use as you go through the process. You can use it for settlement, therefore call it a settlement certificate. You can call it the surety bond for which it is. It's got the correct seal on it, bonding the full faith and credit of the United States, various different things. And you just have to learn the language so that you can explain it at any point. Now, this one here is the contractual indemnification of government contractors. Frank P. Grodd, Table of Contents. It says, recent doctrinal changes in the law of government liability that limit the range of federal obligations. Current rules generally relating to indemnities. The common law of indemnity. Current statutory basis for indemnities for federal contractors. And those states would be the federal contractors. They would be such. Contracts for research and development for military departments. National Defense Contracts Act. Department of Health and Human Services. Contracts for research and investigation. 42, that's Social Security. U.S.C. 241. Remember that those graphs I showed you about the birth certificate and the death certificate. That's what we're talking about, is the reversion and merger of the estate back with the one it belongs to. And we're going to investigate the record. And through that research, we're going to find out those contracts were all voidable. So we're going to void them for what they are: inconsistent and impossible. Had I known, I should have never been lying like that. But since I didn't know it wasn't a lie, it was a mistake, error, accident, whatever, it's forgivable. Indemnification agreements under the Price-Anderson Amendments Act for public contractors involved in nuclear energy operations. Contract Settlement Act of 1944. Assumption of liabilities, authorization of Veterans Affairs, Department of Medicine and Surgery, United States Information Agency. If you read my statement of separation in my community, on my community page of El Perro, it's in 4 sections. In one of those states, it mentions the United States Information Agency, and that's what I'm addressing here. The statement of separation is that there's a distinct difference in what the record portrays, and here they are. I'm not a resident. I'm not a United States citizen. Had I known these simple 2 things, I'd have never been putting such perjurious lies to the record. Under 18 U.S.C. 911 and 912, I'm not supposed to be doing that. That's a 3-year sentence. Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities, indemnities for loss of or damage to artworks and other objects. Artworks would be like your own creations. This is the First Amendment stuff. Environmental Protection Agency, authorization of indemnification under the Superfund law. Why do you think I keep preaching about that easement? That's under the Environmental Protection Agency. That's how it's all funded. Part we're considering is procedural aspects of entering into contractual indemnities. Indemnity regulations under the National Defense Contracts Act, Public Law number 85-804. Indemnification requests, agency action, claiming indemnification, agency regulations. So we'll be reading this stuff. Let's see, is there anything else? We might check that stuff out too. This stuff here, 513, 519. Anyway, introduction says the indemnification of government contractors is closely connected to the procurement process, the process by which the government obtains the goods and services to perform its governmental function. And like I said before, in the prepaid expenses, insurance and taxes are prepaid expenses. So the indemnification is a type of insurance bonding. So it's a prepayment. It's got to be done first. You have to give them that acknowledgement. You have to let them know those indemnification clauses. That's part of the payment. That's part of the consideration. A man is bound by his word. So how valuable are the words? That's where the value comes from, folks. It is of continuing interest to government contractors and their attorneys, as well as to plaintiffs, lawyers, and their clients, who have an interest in recovery for injuries and damages suffered in accidents caused by products and services supplied by government contractors. There's also a more general interest in public protection in the protection of victims of mass injuries that may result from catastrophic accidents in government contracts. They're talking about the shuttle disaster, 1986 shuttle disaster, has brought issues of governmental and manufacturer responsibility into high relief and has made issues of liability a subject of wide popular discussion. Examples of other well-publicized sources of potential liability abound. First, the publicity given to the Agent Orange litigation and to its ongoing settlement discussions have alerted the public to possible peacetime liabilities growing out of past government action related to military operations. Second, the continuing concerns over the safety of nuclear power also raised the indemnification issue. The tenfold increase in government contractor indemnification under the most recent amendments to the Price-Anderson Act indicates an awareness of the dimensions of nuclear hazards. And the way we're moving today in this, what they call this sovereign movement, it's bringing a greater awareness the same way in a dimension of knowledge that, hey, we're learning this stuff and we're learning how to implement it appropriately. This is why I say we don't have a right to protest, folks. That's the wrong way of doing it, in my opinion. In addition, regular media attention concerning the need to find a permanent disposal site for nuclear waste, as well as the recent attention to the radon gas problem and government efforts to find a site to dispose of radon-polluted soil, raises recurring thoughts of government responsibility and indemnification. And as we see here recently with the pandemic, third, government involvement in testing for AIDS virus and government contracts calling for the development of AIDS immunizing agents have the government and its contractors at substantial risk, for which government indemnification will likely be sought. Fourth, news stories involving contractors manufacture propellants for outer space rocketry and accounts of vast government contracted military defense systems also raise the issue of indemnification in government contracts. Finally, biological investigation involving gene splicing, including contracted plant research conducted by the Department of Agriculture with genetically altered organisms, has also created anxieties. They use that term anxieties, folks. Like I've said before, it's a psychological attack. They use psychologic language, and you have to learn how to not let it trigger you. You have to understand how to read it for what it is. So let's look at this. What page were we looking at? 480. Policy considerations in the provisions of indemnities. Authorization for contractual indemnification has not been developed in accordance with an overall plan or pattern, but has responded to particular needs and exigencies of the government and the industries affected. The availability of contractual indemnification is a benefit the government bestows on a limited number of groups and callings. Indemnities have been used quite regularly to induce defense contractors to engage in production or services for the government that may subject the contractor to claims and potential liabilities not shared by other manufacturers and providers. Ordinary services, such as transportation services rendered by commercial airlines, were selected for indemnification when, in the national interest, airlines had to assume unusual risks because they provide an unusual service, such as war risks in flying their routes. In many instances, the indemnification of a dangerous activity carried out under contract is justified not because the contractor is under any obligation to assume the risky contract, but because Congress has declared that undertaking the risky activities advances national interests. See, those airlines and railroads and all those things like that, they're not for your interest. They're for the advancement of national interests, and that's the gross domestic product. It's the result. As long as they can keep getting the result out of the slaves, they will keep producing slaves just as much. Thus, indemnification for risks of nuclear power production was legislatively justified on the grounds that the country needed the additional power for its economic development, growth, and welfare. They determined that nuclear power was the best choice. Keep voting for them. Says, in the case of the International Space Program, indemnification of contracts involving substantial hazards was justifiable both in terms of national security and economic development. Indemnification of shortwave radio facilities and stations and of persons and organizations that lend valuable artworks and other objects for exhibition here and abroad can be seen as an effort to improve the international relations of the United States and to contribute to the international amity. So they understand facilities and stations and have persons and organizations that lend valuable artworks and other objects. Where do you think a nation gets its wealth to begin with? Everything comes from the people. So they're going for the international amity as an effect, which I agree is a good thing. But to dismiss the people for their involvement and try to make them slaves somehow through your commercial demands is preposterous. The purpose of government indemnities in the public health area, such as indemnities for experimental treatments and other activities carried out in veterans hospitals, is to limit the liability of contractual participants in the rendition of public health services that Congress supports as being in the public interest, but which carry risks and liabilities to the public that might otherwise dissuade participants. To the public, which carry risks and liabilities to the public. The swine flu program, which was not by its terms an indemnity program, interestingly provided an alternative to the provision of indemnities. When a project is considered of such overwhelming national interest that it should be undertaken regardless of liabilities, direct government responsibility is an alternative to indemnity.
I remember reading years ago that most jobs, you don't really get a contract for most jobs. You just like sign a safety agreement or something. Is that true, Keith?
I don't know. I still see most places taking applications, but a lot of them will do it online now. But generally, still some type of application, and then depending on what line of work, they might have you do the safety thing.
It's like employees at will or something they called it. Yeah, I don't know what that
Yeah,
means.
could be. Yeah, and that I think that's one of them more modern terms coming of the age of technology, being able to work from home and being medical transcriptionists and things like that. And But anyway, it goes on and says procedural aspects of entering into contractual indemnities. Laws that authorize the inclusion of indemnities in government contracts are not self-executing. All of them state the conditions that must be met before contractual indemnification will be granted. And they also designate the official who must determine that the conditions have been met. These conditions usually involve unusual risks or risks that cannot be covered by commercially available insurance. There isn't any commercially available insurance if you get beat up by a cop, is there? There's medical insurance. But there's no indemnification. Another element for consideration is that government procurement of products and services is subject to a variety of detailed regulations that not only aim at providing the government with the best products and services at the least cost, but that also serve many other policy purposes. Preferences for small and minority-owned businesses, preferences for reclaimed rather than virgin materials, exclusions of bidders who have violated environmental laws. Bidders, that's what they call it. You're bidding for a contract. When you go down to McDonald's and they've got an advertisement in the paper, now hiring, and you go down and fill out that application, you're bidding for a job. That's your bid. How much did you wager? Compliance with affirmative action requirements for handicapped workers and disabled veterans, and many others. That's that affirmative action. See, affirmative action. So I come upon a conundrum if I can fulfill the affirmative action. If I only have one job position open, how do I fulfill the affirmative action of percentage of employees by those affirmative action scales? It's a disability itself. It's an impossibility itself. Thus, the procurement of services and products has long been the subject of detailed procurement codes and regulations in which the provisions relating to the inclusion of contractual indemnities are also used to advance certain policies. 48 CFR 52.212-5, contract terms and conditions required to implement statutes or executive orders. Equity acts in personam. Equity imputes an intent to fulfill an obligation. So make it so. Be the boss and contract it. Make your bid. Make it the best bid. Let them know you got a king at the table. Somebody who knows what they're doing. You're not going to let them entice you into some bullshit. Contract terms and conditions required to implement statutes or executive orders when it comes to their commercial products and commercial services. Period. So the mass of procurement, and that's from the federal regulations 48 CFR, which is Federal Acquisitions Regulations. That's why I brought that one up. The mass of procurement regulations have undergone significant rearrangement. On September 19, 1983, the General Services Administration, the Department of Defense, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration issued a joint document establishing a new federal acquisition regulation, codified in Chapter 1, Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations, leaving Chapters 2 through 4 of Title 48 for individual agency implementations and supplementations of the FAR. Individual agency, which is the presumption that you provided general services. You personally provided general services. This is why I refuse to sign their documents anymore, particularly when they shove one across the table that says, release paperwork. They were trying to release my personal services to do the general services of filling out the paperwork, the official documentation. Not going to do it no more. I know better now. The new FAR system replaced both the earlier federal procurement regulation system for civilian contracts and the defense acquisitions regulations for defense contracts. These earlier regulations remain a part of the CFR. However, because both the DAR and FPR provisions continue to apply to contracts, which preceded April 1st, 1984, the effective date of the FAR. So they're saying they just combine them, just like common law. They combine civilian contracts with defense contracts, and now it's just the federal acquisitions regulations. In general, the indemnity provisions in the FAR and in the contract clauses that provide for contractual indemnity follow both the terms of the statutory authorization for indemnification and the statutory language. They offer very few elaborations. The language of the regulations, moreover, is not subject to judicial review in the usual sense, because the grant or denial of a contractual indemnity is not subject to judicial review. The interpretation of the language by the public official administering the indemnity is final, subject only to a corrective revision of the authorizing legislation by Congress. The interpretation of the language by the public official administering the indemnity is final, subject only to a corrective revision of the authorizing legislation by Congress. In other words, they have to show his judgment is final. If you have any objection to it, he has to show you how it is final. He has to show you the congressional legislation saying, no, you can't do that.
Well, that's why indemnify sounds a little like indefinite, right? There's no statute of limitations on fraud.
Correct. Indemnity regulations under the National Defense Contracts Act, Public Law Number 85/804. National Defense Contracts Act contains the most broadly applicable regulation on contractual indemnities. The Act covers a long list of military and civilian government departments and agencies that have significant national defense functions and stipulates that indemnity clauses may only be included in such agencies' contracts when this would advance the national defense. It's prerequisite that the national defense is for the very people, so it must advance the people. Pure and simple. The authority to enter into such contracts can only be granted by the secretary or administrator of the agency concerned. Indemnification agreements authorized by an agency head are not limited to amounts appropriated or to contract authorization. Indemnification agreements authorized by an agency head are not limited to amounts appropriated or to contract authorization. They're not up for judicial discretion. You can put your amount down. Indemnification request. Contractors requesting indemnification contracts under the National Defense Contracts Act. It is a birth enumeration at birth, minimum birth registration requirements. And there is plain writing in government contracts. And in 5 U.S.C. 301 departmental regulations, it specifically says it is applicable to the Department of Defense, wherein they then state the plain writing in government documents and the minimum birth registration requirements. It is applicable to the Department of Defense in plain writing. Not yourself. We've been duped in a spell of illness. Must supply certain information to the contracting officer. Contractors requesting indemnification contracts under the National Defense Contracts Act must supply certain information to the contracting officer. First, the contractor must identify and define the unusually hazardous or nuclear risk and state how the contractor would be exposed to such risk. Second, since the indemnification applies only to the extent that the claim is not compensated for by insurance, the contractor must furnish a statement disclosing all insurance coverage applicable to the stated risk. This is your fee schedule. If this happens, this is how much it costs. This is what insurance cover. This is what it's going to cover. If you take fingerprints, it's $25,000. If you take my photo, it's another $25,000. Whatever you put. The contractor must also disclose the controlling factor for determining the amount of coverage and the availability, cost, and terms of additional insurance. If the contractor is part of a parent corporation, it must supply the contracting officer with the precise legal relationship between the companies and reveal whether the parent company has insurance coverage that bears on the risk for which the contractor seeks indemnification. So if you are committing yourself to being that United States citizen, I urge you not to, and recognize that it is, in fact, a United States business. So if the contractor is part of a parent corporation known as the United States, it must supply the contracting officer with the precise legal relationship between the companies and reveal whether the parent company has insurance coverage that bears on the risks for which the contractor seeks indemnification. And that would, of course, again, be full faith and credit. That's all I'm seeking. I'm seeking full faith and credit as the remedy in indemnification, because I know the precise legal relationship. That birth certificate is a bond. And it acts as a surety. And I can put my indemnification contract terms and surrender it to the United States, the parent company, for that equal consideration of full faith and credit for everything I've already paid into the system, and put forth that fee schedule, letting them know that from now on, no. Third, if the contractor has entered into other government contracts that provide indemnification against similar risks, the contractor must report this information with the description of any limitations contained in those contracts. What is the Social Security? I want the Social Security statement. I want the live numetent, and I want the decedent numetent. I want all tax records. I want all records in all probate courts. I want all records. Every last one of them. Agency action. The contracting officer is authorized to review the indemnification request and to determine whether all the conditions have been met. Any recommendation for approval to the agency head must include a definition to which all parties have agreed of the unusually hazardous or nuclear risks and the following statements by the contracting officer. That the contract would facilitate the national defense. That the defined risk could expose the contractor to liabilities in excess of insurance coverage. That the contractor is complying with all applicable safety requirements, and whether the indemnification would be extended to subcontractors. You understand that, John?
I don't know if I got that one.
That the contract would facilitate the national defense, and the national defense is here for the people. So it wouldn't be a matter of the police. They're not supposed to be talking to us. We're supposed to be protected individuals. So when the police come in front of us, that would be facilitation of a national defense because they committed an international crime against one of the very American people. It's a different status. That the contract would facilitate the national defense. So it's letting you know in that contract, that indemnification contract, you're going to facilitate the national defense, and here's why. I'm not a United States citizen. I'm not a resident, as those terms are defined. I am the contractor known as the American. That the defined risk could expose the contractor to liabilities in excess of the insurance coverage. So by taking on the risk of identifying as the person, I could take on liabilities as a contractor in excess of the insurance. I'm not wanting to do that. That's the risk. I have a person that can do that, and that's what it's used for. 3, that the contractor is complying with all applicable safety requirements. Whether the indemnification would be extended to subcontractors. My person would be a perfect example of a subcontractor. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, even though this U.S. business is an internationally protected entity, we're just taking it, deeper. And
they're not most people don't understand. Again, if the United States is a corporate entity and they have another corporate entity under them known as the state of Iowa, that's still that same type of governmental entity. That commercial government entity we have is the extension of a military government in all fashions. Don't let that fool you. So when we're complying with those commercial venues like the hospital, so many people go to that hospital willingly. And the perfect example is women going to the hospital to give birth. That's something that we do naturally. Yet when you go to the hospital and you give birth through that registration to go into the maternity ward and have your labor, it tells us in the U.S. Code that the spell of illness is when you get inpatient hospital services on the first day. So you go into the hospital, register, and they put you into the maternity ward. That's inpatient hospital services. That's called a spell of illness. How is doing something natural, giving birth to a little baby, bearing your young, how is that natural act a spell of illness? It's not. It portrays that mom is sick. And that's sick. That's a military hospital, folks. It's called a foundling hospital. The schools, they're military schools.
Yeah, then the clerk sells the input data to the probate registrar. Can't believe they do that.
Yep, and that's why I mentioned that graph for the birth certificate and the death certificate and all those agencies it disperses out, and it doesn't create any money until it gets over to the other side of that chart. Remember, at the hospital, it's just the birth clerk. There's no value there yet. It doesn't get monetized until it hits the Health and Human Services. And that's who every state is required to have a state recovery program, and it is operated through the Health and Human Services of every state. In deciding whether to approve the request for an indemnification clause, an agency head shall consider such factors as self-insurance, to extend indemnification to subcontractors, other proof of financial responsibility, workers' compensation insurance, and the availability of private insurance. Approval of the recommendations is issued in the memorandum of decision. Only then can the contracting officer enter into agreement with the contractor using the same procedures as those required for entering agreements with other contractors. So you basically have to make sure that the one that you're contracting with has those clauses, so then you can enter into that same contract to then turn around and extend that contract to a subcontractor. Amazing how this works. The contract clause for indemnification under the Act provides that the government will indemnify the contractor against claims by third persons for death, personal injury, or loss of, damage to, or loss of use of property. And the government will also identify the contractor for any loss of, damage to, or loss of use of the contractor's property. The clause provides that the indemnification is limited to claims arising out of the risks defined in the contract that are not compensated for by insurance otherwise. Fingerprinting, taking my photo, subjecting me to your medical tests, all kinds of things. If the claim results from willful misconduct or lack of good faith on the part of the contractor will be indemnified, or will not be indemnified, other than through subrogation for its own property loss or for any government claims against the contractor. In other words, we have a situation here. It seems like you can claim that person as the contractor and through subrogation set the loss off on him instead of taking it yourself, a direct hit. That seems like that's what the legal entity is for. For crying out loud, we've been calling it the straw man for centuries. It's the pincushion. It's the one that's supposed to take all the suffering. Claiming indemnification. The regulations require contractors to promptly notify the contracting officer of any claim that may be expected to involve indemnification. This includes supplying all pertinent papers the contractor receives and evidence of any claim of loss and how it may be covered under the contract. 94 cases is quite a evidence of loss and how it came about, the cause and effects. The contractor is required by contract to comply with any government directions regarding the settlement or defense of the claim. The indemnification clause provides that the government may direct, control, or assist in the defense or settlement of any claims or actions. And this is imperative to understand here if we're dealing with trust, like we've been talking, it's trust operation, and you have to come at it from that aspect, in my opinion, as the benefactor, the one that can control and settle the matters of the estate as deemed being the true owner. Therefore, they may assist in the defense or settlement while you direct and control it. Agencies are required to maintain complete records of all indemnity actions taken pursuant to the Act, and they may also report to Congress annually on actions taken on requests for relief under the Act, including indemnification. So it's telling us here the indemnification is a relief. The agency is required to retain for each request for relief processed the contractor's request, the memorandum of decision, a copy of the contract, equity acts in personam. It imputes an intent to fulfill an obligation. So what you're doing is you're allowing for the obligation to be fulfilled, that if you've got so many credits in an account and you end up having to fend a claim and you get found to be guilty, they can take those credits from your account and not return them. On credit. A copy of the contract. A device used to obtain money, property, labor, or services on credit. And for all relevant memoranda, correspondence, affidavits, and other pertinent documents. The annual reports required under the Act show that no claims for indemnification were made in the last 5 years. And appropriate personnel in DOD and DOJ cannot recall any such claims in the past. That sounds like a perfect remedy and solution to me, folks. We lost John there. Says his power went out. The annual reports required under the Act show that no claims for indemnification were made in the last 5 years. And appropriate personnel in Department of Defense and Department of Justice cannot recall any such claims in the past. Sounds like they're sitting there waiting for these claims, folks. I don't know about you. Agencies authorized to execute indemnity agreements under the National Defense Contracts Act include NASA, Department of Defense, and Department of Energy. NASA has adopted its own procedures for entering into indemnification agreements with government contractors. For example, in addition to the FAR procedures for requesting indemnification, NASA requires a contractor to include copies of all relevant third-party comprehensive liability policies and product liability policies or the equivalent. NASA provides, welcome back, John.
Yep, back on.
NASA provides the contracting officer with a standard definition of unusually hazardous risks. So in order for this stuff to apply, you have to be part of NASA, who uses the standard definition, unusually hazardous risk, and defines it themselves. So as a regular man walking down the street, none of this would apply to you. But you have a general services contract through that state identification. That's the one that's been causing all the defamation. This clause differs from in that under NASA's indemnification clause, the government shall only be liable for loss in excess of the contractor's insurance or 500 million, whichever is the larger amount. Contract clause used by the FAR does not impose any limits on appropriation. That's what we said earlier. The Defense Department's use of indemnification under the national defense contracts is limited to situations in which the contractor cannot be indemnified under 10 U.S.C. Section 2354, which governs military contracts for research and development, but meets all requirements prescribed by the FAR. Military contracts for research and development. You gentlemen out there got a selective service number? Hey, ladies, go to the Social Security site and see if you can, if you've ever registered for the military, look it up and see if you've got a selective service number. I'm sure if you registered for the selective service, they gave you a number, even as women. Isn't that a government contract? Isn't that a government defense contract? The authority granted by the Act may be used to provide indemnification in contracts involving unusually hazardous risks in research and development work, as well as for work that cannot be so classified. The Department of Energy is authorized to execute agreements under the Act only for functions transferred to that department from another authorized agency. See how limited they are? Atomic Energy. Claiming indemnification. The contractor must give the Department of Energy notice of any claim made against the contractor or any other person included in the contract and furnish the Department of Energy with any pertinent papers received by or filed with respect. Yep, same thing. You're just going to keep giving them each one that you make a claim, indemnification, whichever one you make a claim with, General Services Administration. That's what they're going to want. All those documents. You got them. They're all in your hands. The agency head may authorize the head of the contracting agency to offer the contractor general authority indemnity agreement when statutory indemnity under the Atomic Energy Act does not cover the contract. Same thing as it was saying before. Can give general authority for indemnity agreement where insurance isn't availed. Alternatively, the head of the contracting agency is authorized to offer the contractor nuclear liability insurance. Again, same thing. If they can find any insurance that they can offer you, then they will try to do so. Department of Energy contractors covered by the Atomic Energy Act are generally not required or permitted to carry insurance against public liability for nuclear accidents unless they do not qualify for indemnity. So why is everybody told that you have to have insurance? Do you not qualify for indemnity? These are the things. This is why I research this stuff. It helps me come up with questions like this. Isn't that a great question, John?
Yeah, and especially when we're supposedly selling insurance, right?
Absolutely.
That's one of the assumptions that they make. If you look deep into the codes, we're going door to door selling insurance.
Yeah, the documents we sign, called an endorsement, is an amendment to an insurance policy. Quaint, huh? So, in that case, the insurance must also be approved by the Office of Industrial Relations and cannot exceed $1 million in coverage. So they give them a pretty good limit on that coverage, though. Here we go. NASA contractual indemnity regulation, and it starts out with NASA treats contractual indemnities as part of its regulation of extraordinary contractual actions. NASA has decided not to use the residual powers authorized by the National Defense Contracts Act and by FAR, subpart 50.4, and not to include in its contracts the clause authorized under Public Law 85-4804. NASA thus uses its own indemnification regulations and its own contract clause. Hint, hint. Hint, hint. Learn this stuff and learn how it applies so you can start creating your own and teaching your little ones. Contractor requests for the exercise of the indemnification authority are to be forwarded to the Assistant Administrator for Procurement, who must then review it and forward the contractor request through channels to the Administrator for approval. If the Administrator approves, he signs a memorandum of decision. The information that must be submitted is the same as that required by the FAR. In addition, the information must include a copy of relevant third-party comprehensive liabilities policies and product liability policies. The contract clause for NASA contracts cross-references to a number of FAR and Public Law number 85-804 clauses, but requires the inclusion of a special clause on space activity, unusually hazardous risk. The contracting officer must submit a report directly to the Contract Adjustment Board when an indemnification provision is included in any NASA prime contract pursuant to the authority of the Administrator's Memorandum Decision, including 2 copies of the Memorandum Decision and 2 copies of any clause which deviates from the indemnification clauses prescribed and complies with the requirement of Public Law 85-804 and Executive Order 10789. Requirements similar to FAR requirements. In other words, they're saying you got to pretty much give them the same documentation. They got to have proof that that documentation is legit and valid, and you're keeping track of things, and it meshes with the balance. The Contract Adjustment Board must retain these submissions. EPA regulations governing indemnification of Superfund. What's a Superfund? Sarah. Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 1986. To carry out the mandate of Section 119 of the Superfund Law as added. The EPA has adopted an interim guidance document. The document is addressed to regional administrators and directors of toxics and waste management divisions and provides detailed guidance for their indemnification response action contractors working for the EPA and for other federal agencies. The interim guidance provides for indemnification of RACs working at Superfund sites for states, potentially responsible parties, and the EPA, including RACs working for the United States Army Corps of Engineers. In its background information, the interim guidance notes, prior to the reauthorization of CERCLA, EPA provided indemnification to RACs working for EPA through contract authority implementing CERCLA. EPA took this step in order to retain qualified contractors, given the absence of pollution liability insurance coverage. Under this old indemnification agreement, the federal government indemnified RACs above an initial $1 million for third-party liabilities and defense expenses. The indemnification agreement was void in case of gross negligence or with willful misconduct. That's the indemnification clause that we want. The indemnification agreement is void in case of gross negligence or willful misconduct. These people, as public officials, have a basic obligation to public service, and that is to communicate as part of their conduct as the obligated party to us. That doesn't mean we go out protesting. Again, it's a petition to the government for redress of grievances, and you have to do it with Socratic logic, reason, and respect in private. Noting that Section 119 of C.O.W.A.R.D.S responds to many of the concerns of the RAC community, the interim guidance document states that the section establishes a standard of negligence for actions brought against RACs under federal law. Standard of negligence, and that's what I'm talking about with the public officials. There's a standard of negligence. They've got a basic obligation of public service. Therefore, there's a standard of negligence. There's an equal and opposing dynamic they have to recognize. However, if an action is brought under state law, a strict liability standard could apply. The guidance document reiterates the provision of limited indemnification against pollution liability arising from RAC negligence on a discretionary basis. The interim guidance document then recites the limits and deductibles under statutory indemnification provisions and asserts that RAC indemnification provides an adequate substitute for insurance. The interim guidance document asserts that discretionary indemnification is an interim vehicle that will keep the Superfund program operative until the insurance industry returns to the RAC liability insurance market. So it's basically saying that there is no liability insurance market. Yeah, is that what you get out of that, John?
Yeah. I mean, surprisingly, it would seem that it doesn't really exist.
The interim guidance document asserts that discretionary indemnification is an interim vehicle that will keep the Superfund program operative until the insurance industry returns to the RAC liability insurance market. So it literally sounds like they're doing indemnification in lieu of liability insurance. Does that seem fair to say?
Well, I mean, look at our government. It's a military-run insurance company, so I guess it makes perfect sense.
Absolutely. I think it does. And discretionary indemnification does not create a federally intrusive insurance program that interferes with private sector efforts to develop RAC liability insurance coverage. See, they're talking about private sector and efforts to develop liability insurance coverage. I wonder if that's almost like that's one of them flip-flops in the language. With private sector efforts to develop liability insurance coverage, where if there's no liability insurance coverage, you would still have indemnification. So why would the private sector need liability insurance coverage when they could fall under the same discretionary indemnification, particularly when the language earlier said we could write it for our own amount? It's not judicial. It's up to the discretion of the one making the final memorandum of decision. So I would suggest making it reasonable, of course. But your value on this stuff is not up for judgment generally.
This goes into how mortgages are backed by the Department of Agriculture too. I mean, it's a little different.
Oh yeah, yeah. The whole system's, folks. The whole system is based on the Farm Credit Act. All that credit, even for their public funding, FDIC and all that, that all comes from agricultural funding. The Farm Agricultural Act, or Farm and Agricultural Credit Act, or something like that. I'll have to look it up again. And notice, folks, this is from the Administrative Law Journal. Administrative law. They're telling you what those courts are doing. They're contracts. They're courts of contracts, but they're wanting that insurance, that liability insurance, when you can provide indemnification outside of it from the private sector. That liability insurance is for supposed contractors that are contracting with the government. And that's what that identification is all about, that resident. You're taking upon that address and signing the legal name as an agent for that service of process, administrative process. So it's a matter of learning how to, like I said, equity imputes an intent to fulfill an obligation. And what was it? Equity imputes an intent to fulfill an obligation, and I said it earlier, John. There are two maxims anyway.
Yeah, I'm kind of sleeping at the switch.
Oh, equity acts in personam. I got it. Equity acts in personam.
There you go.
Equity imputes an intent to fulfill an obligation, and if the intent to fulfill an obligation is there, equity acts in personam means you got to do it through a contract. Write it down. Give them your intent and your considerations and projections and whatnot, and your desired effect. And that's what we're talking about with the indemnification. It's in contract form. We're not contracting, but equity acts in personam. It's just an acting in personam. We're not in personam, but we're acting in personam. So we're providing a document of like kind in contractual form, but it's from the private sector, and I control and settle the matters. And I'm doing so now. I'm financing it. Finance, to settle, to put an end to, before it starts. That sounds like a prepayment.
So they never really contract right or properly, so that's why they set up trust, so that the trust can sort it out later.
Correct. Express that trust. I assure you, folks. Understanding what I do now, expressing the trust is imperative. In expressing that trust, it's imperative that you learn trust law, so you understand the power of being whatever party you need to be in that trust. Understand how to contract. These are all elements you have to learn before you can start doing a lot of this stuff. But I urge everybody not to believe me. Don't believe the neighbor. Don't believe the government. Crying out loud. Don't believe your mother. Do your research so you know. We all have to do it. All right. And that's the end of the stream for tonight. I'm going to be back tomorrow night. Let me drop that link in the chat for everybody too, before I forget. So you guys can go through and read that in full as well. We're just merely talking about being able to take those negotiable instruments and learn how to negotiate them ourselves, because woe ye lawyers who have taken away the key of knowledge. They try to hide these things or whatnot and say they don't know it. The county attorney says he's not subject to federal code. The fuck you aren't. So it's imperative to gain that knowledge ourselves, so we can start doing the directing and settling and controlling of all these estates, instead of handing them over to the government in a spell of illness, for crying out loud. And with that, what do you got on the way out, John?
No, I'm just thinking how, like, another definition of trust might be like a delayed process of contracting. I never thought of them like that, you know.
Yeah.
This show helped me, open my mind on trust and contract. Good show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And tomorrow we're going to get into index funds. And remember, we talked about the super fund. That's what index funding is. It's super funding things. And so we're going to go over some terms for that tomorrow, and hopefully we'll see everybody there then. In the meantime, hit the like, share, and subscribe button, folks. There's a PayPal link down there for anybody that wants to share some love. Every little bit is appreciated. And you folks know me. I love you, but I don't give a rat's ass whether you love me back or not. I say I don't care if you hate me. I don't care if you don't respect me. That's on you. So may God bless you and have a good night. Bye now.